The corpse-coated ruler of the Rotten Vale, Vaal Hazak made its debut as one of the new elders in Monster Hunter World. Living in tranquil symbiosis with the bacteria-laden carrion pits it calls home, it would seem Vaal is perfectly sculpted for the Vale, but delving into some of its physical features and the Black Veil variant may suggest a history and biology every bit as odd as its appearance. Probably the best place to start with Vaal Hazak is asking what's up with that corpse coat and the relationship with effluvium. And this is actually careful cultivation by Vaal Hazak as it feeds on the effluvium. By lining its body with hooks and then moving through carrion, it acquires a layer of rotting flesh for the effluvium to feed on, and in turn it attains its own nutrients by drawing the reproducing effluvium into its body. So Vaal Hazak is very much a farmer, cultivating its crop for harvest as it sits amid its pile of carrion. Obviously, this sounds more than just a bit far out. But is it? Well, the hagfish, the gift that just keeps on giving, effectively does just this. Hagfish have semi-permeable skin, and it's to the point that this actually allows them to take in nutrients through their skin and gills, to the point where they can mostly feed through this method. This is to maximize nutrient intake, but it's also believed to be due to their role as seafloor scavengers, and they often burrow into carcasses of marine life and eat their way out. But these findings suggest that they may well also be eating the whole way through, and just squelch down into carcasses to absorb nutrients straight from the medium they're suspended in. So to begin to apply this to Vaal Hazak, it's described as feeding in a similar method. Vaal is mentioned numerous times to draw effluvium back into the body and also inhale it as well, and watching the actual animations of Vaal sucking down the effluvium does seem to suggest a lot of this is done via the skin and/or gill-like organs mentioned. So it does seem that in hagfish fashion Vaal can draw nutrients from the surroundings via its modified epidermis. The fact it's also described as specifically inhaling the effluvium is interesting too, as hagfish can also use their gills for nutrient absorption as well as gas. Whatever Elder and especially Vaal Hazak's lungs or analogue organs look like, it could well be the same in that it could feed with its respiratory organs as well. This is one of a few factors that seem to suggest Vaal Hazak may have an aquatic or coastal origin. It seems hagfish evolved this trait due to a scavenging lifestyle, but this may not necessarily be the same route Vaal took, even if that's where it wound up. It's hard to get nutrients dissolved in air. In water vapour quite possibly, but this isn't an adaptation we'd expect to see in something purely terrestrial. And after all, it's much more likely Vaal had the ability to eat through its skin before it arrived in the Vale and co-opted the effluvium for food. Being able to engage in such feeding is most often seen in estuarine invertebrates, as they feed primarily on the nutrient-enriched water disgorged where the river meets the sea. Vaal still has a mouth, and as we'll explore in a bit, it may once have used it extensively, but it may have initially developed this ability from being a littoral species that gain additional nutrients from estuarine areas of enriched water. After all, the skin is a huge organ with a massive surface area on most animals, and when we factor in wings too, then the amount of nutrients it can possibly take up in a reasonably rich area would be quite impressive. Right now I'm suggesting tidal areas due to the seeming lack of large water bodies in the New World, but it could be possible that Vaal had a freshwater origin too. But this is not to say that Vaal may not have indulged in carrion coat behaviour prior to the creation of the Vale. And the Vale is likely a relatively young ecosystem that's probably preceded by Vaal or something close enough to it. Giant marine life exists in Monster Hunter with animals like Ceodius, Abyssal Agaiacrus and Nakarkos, not to mention actual whales themselves. Plus there's giant elders like Zora, who can occasionally die at sea or in coastal areas. Any of these may have caused Vaal Hazak to congregate nearby to absorb the rich runoff from the carcass, or potentially burrow itself in something of a prototype version of what the species would later achieve in the Vale. It may also be something of an atavism as well, as juvenile hagfish share this ability with their parents, although they have much thinner skin in comparison, and it's likely that baby Vaal Hazak, whatever they look like, function in a similar way to adults, Being smaller, it's much easier for them to get their nutrients via absorption as they need a lot less of it. And they can also climb inside much smaller carcasses. This may have always been the modus operandi of neonate Vaal Hazak, and the adults never dropped it, as it's always good to get more nutrients when you can if you spend a lot of time submerged. Only once they got to the Vale did they adapt to use this completely for nutrient intake. But if Vaal Hazak weren't always smothered in effluvium or fungi in the past, what, if anything, were they covered in? And maybe coral or something akin to it could be the answer. We already know that some coral or coral-like organisms in Monster Hunter are weird. This is evidenced by the existence of the Coral Highlands. Coral in our own world is famous for not being on dry land. But it's also mentioned the highlands were formed when Azora Magdaros, or similar elder, died, erupted, and launched regular coral from out of the sea, then managed to survive in the atmosphere. This could initially be an adaptation to tidal areas, with coral that can still function without water, even if temporarily and ignoring how that would work, which would give them a competitive advantage over deeper sea corals. Coral can be a bit funny on where they land, with a lot of real species preferring to settle and become polyps in areas with certain algae for them. And Monster Hunter coral may have some preference for energy, as it's mentioned that Everstream helped them survive. So maybe Vaal Hazak's skin was already designed to assist in the settlement and growth of organisms long before they ever got to the Vale, and the first host may have been algae, which in turn may have even hosted coral. Not only may this have provided some nutrients, but it may have also been excellent camouflage for Vaal Hazak to both hunt and hide from other monsters. The original symbiosis may have been the hosts giving Vaal Hazak food and camouflage in exchange for a home and assisted dispersal, because other parts of Vaal's morphology hint at a coastal and tidal lifestyle too. Vaal Hazak has a pharyngeal jaw, which is to say a xenomorph-like mouth within a mouth. In the official lore, Vaal currently uses this jaw to assist in gaining nutrients, albeit in a roundabout way. It's said to use them to hold prey still so the effluvium alone can apparently kill them, and then it feeds on the effluvium, which is a bit Rube Goldberg to say the least. But then it's not unreasonable Vaal may take to killing to make its own fertilizer in periods of lean carrion fall. But in this description what may have been the original use for the jaws is mentioned. It's said after the initial grab, Vaal Hazak then pulls the prey to the back of its throat with the pharyngeal jaws. And this is effectively what pharyngeal jaws are made for. Most fish can't actually swallow properly outside of a liquid medium. Not that this really matters to them, as long-term leave of said medium rarely ends well enough that starvation ever becomes a concern. But some do forage in tidal zones, where they may capture prey or spend long periods of time outside of water, and some species of Moray Eel are among these, being famous for having pharyngeal jaws themselves. The morays use their unique feeding apparatus to both secure prey and then swallow it, without being submerged in water, and this allows them to still take reasonably sized prey on land to be swallowed whole. So this has some interesting applications for Vaal Hazak when considered with other aspects of its physiology discussed prior as well, and both seem to strongly hint at Vaal having a marine origin, with it still retaining very early specializations of marine animals that dabble into coming onto land. Elders can be associated with marine habitats. Some old lore about Elatrion suggests it may apparently be marine as well, and Namael is said to be as well. Life initially came from the ocean, and Vaal may potentially provide a look at what the first elders may have looked like when they first came from the ocean too. The assorted epidermal abilities elder dragons possess may have first come from them attempting gas exchange, or nutrient acquisition through them. Diet-wise, some elders do still eat normal foods like meat. Nargigante is said to prey on anything else when elder dragons aren't available. For Vaal itself, it may have had a surprisingly normal seafood diet, to supplement skin-based absorption of nutrients. Fish, crustaceans, cephalopods, and any other marine life that also occupied tidal zones would have been fine fare for it. It's also interesting to speculate what Vaal's internal organs may now look like. If Vaal used to eat more normal foods, it likely had a more normal digestive system. And what remains of this now is anyone's guess as to whether it's still extant albeit dormant, or if it's been atrophied and possibly even replaced. Another part of Vaal Hazak's cranial morphology that hints at a marine past is the rest of the mouth too. Vaal has a very long jaw with hooked teeth at the end and no skin over the mandible. This is very similar to a type of deep-sea fish known as loose jaws. Loose jaws have a very similar heads to Vaal Hazak, and the bizarre mandibles are to significantly reduce drag when closing the jaw. As a result of this, loose jaws can close their jaws very quickly in water, allowing them to snatch swift, wary prey. This bizarre morphology results in comparatively weak jaws as well. But this doesn't really matter as they only need a single swift piercing strike to deal with soft-bodied prey. The huge reduction in drag also means a huge reduction in the amount of muscle needed to close the jaw, so this type of jaw also represents a significant metabolic saving too. The latter part especially already fits very well for Vaal Hazak, who's a pretty sedentary low-energy elder and was likely always that way. The rapid strike jaws fits very well for an ambush predator, and are incredibly unlikely to ever form outside of a marine animal. In short, just another feature that adds to the theory of Vaal Hazak being a formerly marine elder. Thus, it's both enjoyably ironic and potentially testament to elder dragon adaptability and extremophile ability that Vaal Hazak's preferred habitat went from warm, sunlit, shallow coral reefs to a lightless charnel pit soaked in flesh-eating bacteria. Speaking of, no discussion of Vaal would be complete without looking into effluvium, and in this case you're really spoiled for choice for analogues. After all, flesh-eating bacteria is very much a thing in our world, and it isn't just one species. Necrotizing fasciitis, as the illness is known technically, can be caused by a variety of different species that in turn require different treatments, and can have different levels of urgency. The most frequent types are Staphylococcus or Streptococcus bacteria, the former of which especially is perhaps the most well-known strain for its habit of becoming resistant to antibiotics used to treat it. Both of them can also have an equally dangerous form if they get into your lungs, and whilst this is rare, it's known as necrotizing pneumonia, and is incredibly dangerous. This is worth noting as the effluvium is so dense that it's often in aerosolized form in the Rotten Vale. Clearly, we see a lot of local animals there are resistant to it, and some have gills to filter it like great gyros. But despite this, endemic animals can still fall victim to it, and subadult male and smaller female gyros can occasionally become badly infected with the usual outcome of death. The gills of great gyros do seem to imply then that inhalation is a major entry point for effluvium infection, or at least to initially take hold. Infected animals may then continue to help spread it by exhaling particles of it through the veil as it multiplies inside them, feeding off bodily tissues. Effluvium-infected animals like gyros and ruffinos also appear visibly different on the outside, and do appear to be suffering from necrotizing fasciitis of the muscle, subcutaneous and cutaneous tissue. The vapour given off as the effluvium breeds, as well as its lethal severity, are similar to another type of bacteria that can cause necrotizing fasciitis, which is Clostridium bacteria. Clostridium are arguably even worse, and produce more toxins than other forms of flesh-eating bacteria. A very long list of things that you really don't want inside of you. Some of these are also so severe that they're considered as bioterrorism agents. Clostridium also manifests as gas gangrene, a heavily destructive form of flesh-eating bacteria that, as the name suggests, breaks tissues down into gas. This is so destructive it can break down connective tissues to spread all over the body, and can advance through tissues at a rate of several inches per hour. Without swift treatment, it's invariably fatal. These factors also seem present in the abilities of both Vaal Hazak and the effluvium. The incredible toxicity of Clostridium bacteria can often cause toxic shock, of which the symptoms include altered behaviour like confusion and malaise, often arising from cerebral edema. Effluvium-infected animals will occasionally be uncharacteristically aggressive, and it may well be that they're suffering from toxic shock as a result of the infection, and so attack hunters and other large animals out of confusion and stress. Similarly, in its turf war with Odogaron, Vaal seems to excrete a large amount of effluvium that has a severe effect on Odogaron, causing it to have a seizure or a fit. Effluvium's toxins may be so severe that when inhaling large, concentrated amounts, Even the Vale-dwelling carrion eater Odogaron is temporarily overwhelmed. Overall, the actual effluvium bacteria itself may possess a number of traits across the various flesh-eating bacteria species of Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and Clostridium that all combine to make it such a lethal force able to be used so offensively. So how come some animals seem less affected by it than others? This is hard to say, although much like with frenzy explanations, it may come on a case-by-case basis rather than a single reason. As ever, Deviljho's dragon element may be its saving grace, if we consider that this is something that kills most pathogens. Whenever Deviljho enrages, the dragon produced may kill most of the bacteria so that it can recover. It may also be that Deviljho is just so tall that it can keep its head a lot clearer of the effluvium layer than other wyverns, meaning less overall exposure. Basiljuice and Seething, as potential scavengers and frequent visitors to the Vale, may have some inbuilt immunity over time as well, much as vultures do to many pathogens. Tigrex, Banbaro, and Fulgur Anjanath seem less clear. It could be that the thunder state Fulgur achieves could potentially kill off at least some of the effluvium, or it could be that Anjanath's unique nose apparatus may also help function as a filter to reduce infection. Tigrex at least may be able to leave the Vale too, and once free it may be easier to fight off current infections. Or of course it may be that for the animals that enter the Vale and can't leave again, and it doesn't seem clear if brute wyverns can actually climb back out with their small forelimbs, are effectively living on borrowed time until the effluvium inevitably overwhelms them. Overwhelm monsters it might, but effluvium isn't likely to overwhelm the Vale itself, and this is due to Vaal Hazak keeping careful control over things. Like an algal bloom, explosions in effluvium populations can cause hypoxia of the Vale. When combined with the effluvium eating itself, this quickly results in a crash after, but Vaal actually consumes more effluvium when it detects numbers getting too high, thus keeping the Vale good and stable. Despite elders often being built up as mega ecosystem blower-uppers, this is actually a certain case of one causing stability in ecosystem functioning in a unique habitat. On a similar note, there is a subspecies, Black Veil Vaal Hazak, named for its coat of fungi that's found in the ancient forest. This is an interesting development, and it's said Black Veil is covered in sporangia, constantly releasing fungal spores into the air that have effluvium present. And this is pretty normal. Fungi and bacteria will often be in relationships, with one purpose being that bacteria use fungi as pathways to transport themselves to new areas, just as the effluvium seems to be described to do so. New areas can mean spreading their range, or indeed the co-invasion of new tissues together, which seems to be the deal between Black Veil's sporangia and the effluvium. The fungal spores cause the initial infection of the animal, and then both can feed on it. The lethality of the effluvium may even kill it, and then result in more food for both. Fungal spores that get no luck infecting anything aren't necessarily wasted, as a lot of bacteria can become endospores where they settle in the ground for years, until they enter the right conditions to be reactivated. So effluvium endospores presumably litter the ancient forest and have done so for some time, but only becoming active in the right conditions, and a threat to anything only in the right circumstances. Either way, let's hope everyone in Astera is washing their hands, dressing their wounds, and preparing their food correctly. It may seem odd that Vaal Hazak fresh out of the Vale would just stumble on the Goldilocks fungi to host its resident bacteria, so maybe it occurred the other way around. Black Veil may be the original Vaal Hazak, and lived in the dank, humid depths of the ancient forest with a similar low-energy behaviour to how it operates in the Vale. It's worth noting Vaal normally may not move huge amounts from the nests, and the ones seen in the events of Monster Hunter World may have only come so far up due to the actions of both Zora and Xeno'jiiva disturbing them. When a dispersing Vaal, or perhaps a youngster, got washed into the nearby springs into the canyons that led to the Vale, or the area that became it, the effluvium quickly colonised the land of corpses and no longer had much need for the fungi once they'd saturated the place. Vaal's unique epidermis, designed for nutrient absorption and hosting microorganisms, worked fine for just effluvium as it coated itself in the rotting flesh, and thus the Vale was born. It may not be just maintained by Vaal, but partially created by it too. Black Vale itself may have initially come in from the coast naturally, as an animal that lives in tidal areas will spend at least some of its life on land. And naturally preferring the humid areas, it was only a matter of time before it picked up fungi in lieu of coral, with its skin designed to encourage other organisms to live on it. Being immune to the effluvium as an elder dragon, a partnership was formed as Vaal allowed for great densities of fungi and effluvium to collect in a smaller area than normal, and thus be used for prey capture and in turn to grow the fungi and effluvium even further. It's worth suggesting too then, Black Vale Vaal Hazak may be yet another animal impacted by Rathalos's arrival in the ancient forest. With its changes in the behaviour of Puki Puki, and the impact of fires opening up the forest much more, it would become a drier, less humid environment less favourable to fungi and bacteria. Effective habitat for Vaal may have decreased, and they may have become rarer as a species, whilst their cousins proliferated in the Vale. Fungal or bacterial partnerships may also be nothing new to elder dragons as well. Bioenergy, no one's favourite writing crutch in Monster Hunter world, is vaguely suggested to be like a sort of energy source that gathers where elders tend to die and seems concentrated in volcanic areas like the Elder's Recess, where it can have some impacts on the local fauna there. Considering some animals are suggested to have been formed in areas with high amounts of bioenergy, but with seemingly little explanation of how they acquired it, it may be that it's somewhat akin to radiation, which is just the emission of energy in waves or particles. Living things like fungus can actually consume the energy of radiation harmful to other living things, in a process analogous to photosynthesis, and are thus described as radiotrophic. If some monsters can form a partnership with such fungus themselves, then really they should also be able to gain some energy from radiation too. Maybe it functions like a gut bacteria in other animals, or they have a specialised organ for it. But it could be one such explanation for the whole bioenergy thing going on in the New World, as well as how some elders can attain such power. Some wyverns and other animals may also have similar processes, and be able to benefit from high density areas of bioenergy too. So for my thoughts on Vaal, he's a monster that I initially wasn't the biggest fan of, but did grow to appreciate with time. It was a bit of a weird moment seeing his introduction cutscene and wondering if I was playing Dark Souls instead, but reading more into the lore around him somewhat soothed that. I think the design is interesting and again sort of ties into the Highlands, with him looking more like a deep-sea viperfish or something, and I grew to appreciate it more with the making of this video too. Black Vale I think is okay, but I think the fungal concept is strong enough that it really should have been just saved for an entirely new elder, rather than just a subspecies with little impact on the story. But then Capcom have no problem just replacing monsters, so we'll see. Fight-wise, once you've got past his effluvia gimmick, he can be a bit easy. I know that's effectively all elders, get past the gimmick and they're not too hard, but it's most prevalent with Vaal, who doesn't defend itself nearly as well as the others, and is a lot more sluggish. After Chameleos and maybe Kirin, depending on your thoughts on him, I'd say it's the third easiest elder. In summary though, it's still a relatively decent monster. I also think it's quite cool Vaal has been in the franchise from day one in a way, with concept art from the first game showing something hugely similar to Black Vale, albeit in wyvern form. It only took 14 years for him to fully find his feet. To be clear too, I don't think Capcom made Vaal with an aquatic origin in mind as well. I more think they just picked things like the Pharyngeal Jaw to look creepy and alien over dropping hints about its past. Elders are pretty far out monsters with some pretty far out theories, so let me know what you thought of them here and if you're convinced of my thoughts on Vaal's potential origins. Thanks for watching, and as ever a huge thanks to all patrons, especially Eringar Steiny, Venomenon, Goggles ESM, Mentos and K Sandom. There's a link in the description if you're interested in joining up, and it's always appreciated. If not, by all means engage in the hopefully by now ritualised behaviour of smashing the like button and subscribing if you haven't already. As usual, the wonderful Vaal Hazak skull was created by creature design artist I Am the Kaiju King, who has provided them and other artworks for a number of other videos. So for more of his stuff, be sure to explore his Tumblr for all his pieces with both Monster Hunter, Spec Bio and original works can be found. Be sure to check out his Patreon too if you can to assist him in his creations, as well as if you're keen for more to get exclusive content and early access to artworks. For some of the comments, Simply Vincino pointed out how Shara's actions may have also brought Namael into the Coral Highlands, that could be a factor in driving Legiana to migrate, both through threat and changing the weather. Dawn Tyrant EO also pointed out how Legiana's wings can change their aspect ratio with the slots and fins, allowing them to adapt to different forms of flight in a way other wyverns can't. A few also mentioned the various theories of Legiana potentially being a bird wyvern or giant wingdrake too, and whilst I've never put much thought into these myself, they're definitely interesting ones to consider. So the next video will hopefully be Primal Season 2 at long last. I know many have been waiting for it. The script is already partly done, which will hopefully save some time, although if last time is anything to go by, then making the video is half the struggle and then uploading it past copyright claims is the other. I do have a shorter video in the meantime, as sort of a sequel/response to some of the design comments. That's 90% done and I've been sitting on for a while, and I've been umming and ahhing on uploading it, so maybe that'll be the next video, if Primal is really taking its time to upload and you want something to mull over. We'll have to see, but either way, be assured that Primal now has my full attention until it's released. For after Primal though, normally I like to make it a surprise as to who comes up, but this time let's generate some hype instead. So for the teaser for the next Monster Hunter video,